In Magic, Desert is a land subtype that appears on lands that represent, well, desert regions. The oldest card with the desert subtype is the original Desert from Magic's first expansion, Arabian Nights, which came out way back in 1993. But it's only been given the subtype retroactively. It didn't appear with the subtype actually printed on the card until a reprint as a time-shifted card in Time Spiral. Even then, the subtype didn't matter a whole lot, with only one card, Camel, mentioning deserts at all. But that changed with the release of 2017's Amonkhet, which was set on a desert plain inspired by ancient Egypt. It introduced many more deserts and payoffs for having them for the first time. Since then, deserts and desert payoffs have appeared several more times, the most substantially in 2024's Wild West-inspired Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Overall, deserts have actually performed really well. While there are only 38 of them, an impressive 27 have at least one top 8 at a major Magic event, and in this video we're going to look at the 10 that have had the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's Conduit Pylons. When it enters, you surveil 1, and it can tap for colorless mana. You can also pay 1 generic and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. So this desert comes with some card selection and graveyard synergy, and while it's not efficient at producing mana of any color, it can do it when you need it to. The Pylons have seen play in standard Omniscience combo decks, because they can only play 4 Meticulous Archives after all, and those decks really value Surveil on their lands so they can put Omniscience into the graveyard before bringing it back with Abuelo's Awakening. And once you have Omniscience in play that early, you can win in any number of ways. It's also played in Simic ramp decks in Pioneer, which like deserts because of Outcaster Greenblade and Spinewood's Armadillo. It's also played in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal, where like in Standard, it's played in combo decks that are graveyard-oriented. These decks want to put Mere Retriever into the graveyard with a Pactol Terror in play, then they sacrifice a Retriever in play to Ashnod's Altar, which returns the Retriever, which they can cast with the Altar mana, and from there, you can just rinse and repeat until the opponent is dead. Basically, it turns out a land with a free Surveil that can tap for any color is actually pretty useful, and for that reason it has a pretty good chance at moving higher on the list in the future. At number 9, it's Jagged Barrens. It enters tapped and does 1 damage to the opponent when it enters, and it can tap for black or red. There's a whole cycle of these in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, but this is the only one on the list, and the others aren't even close to making it. Sort of like with Conduit Pylons, we're talking about kind of a subpar looking land, but the fact it gives you a free effect really upgrades it, and that's true here too. Doing 1 to your opponent isn't the most backbreaking play most of the time, but if you're playing an aggro deck in these colors, having a land that can fix your mana while pressuring their life total, even a tiny bit, is a pretty big deal. It's an especially big deal in Pauper, where this card has seen a ton of play in one of the most dominant decks in the format over the last year or so, Rakdos Burn. That deck loves the idea of doing damage with its lands, and Jagged Barrens is going to continue to put up top 8s in Pauper going forward. At number 8, it's the original Desert. It can tap for colorless, and it can also be tapped to do 1 damage to an attacking creature, but you can only activate it during the end of combat step. There are lots of deserts that either do 1 damage or make a player lose life, I suppose referencing how harsh the environment is. We already saw that with the Thunder Junction land cycle, but Desert was of course the first one to do this. With Desert, we continue to see lands that have seemingly small effects are much better than they look. Only producing colorless isn't usually good for your mana base, but in Desert you have a land that can kill X1s for free, or at least keep them from attacking you in the first place. While it was originally printed in 1993, it didn't start seeing play until being reprinted on the time-shifted bonus sheet in Time Spiral. It saw some play in both block and standard at that point, largely in mono-blue control decks, which could take the hit to the mana just fine, and liked the idea of having lands that could be removal spells. These decks ran a full complement of 4 deserts, and once you have multiples in play, your opponent really has to worry about their creatures. Desert has also pinged plenty of creatures in Modern, showing up in mono blue and mono black control decks, but it's done the most in calibrated blast decks. These decks look to cast a blast, and every other card in the deck is either a hugely expensive card, like Emrakul, or a card with Cascade that will hit another calibrated blast. To pull this off, the deck is built with very few non-lands, and Deserts give the deck a way to have some removal in the early game without having to disrupt their combo. Desert is also the third card in a row that sees play in Pauper, and it's still active in Modern and Pauper right now, so the original Desert is likely to remain on this list in the future. At number 7, it's Hashep Oasis. It's part of a cycle of deserts from Hour of Devastation, all of which can tap for colorless, but they can also tap for mana of a specific color while you lose 1 life. In the case of Hashep Oasis, it can tap for green, and they all come with an activated ability that requires you to pay mana and sacrifice a desert. You can of course choose to sacrifice this desert itself, but if you have other deserts lying around, it's even better to give those up, because then this activated ability becomes repeatable. In the case of Hashep Oasis, you can pay 1 generic and 2 green, and target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn, but only at sorcery speed. Notably, this entire cycle also enters the battlefield untapped, unlike many utility lands, so the downside of playing them is pretty low, with the life loss the extent of that. In a vacuum, 3 mana and giving up a land doesn't sound like it's worth it for +3/+3, but it's always important to remember that this card is a land, one that produces much needed mana early, and then later in the game it has a spell-like effect. While this one doesn't always generate a full card of value, it does impact the board and do something meaningful, unlike all of your other lands. Basically, lands with little downside and meaningful abilities, even when they're seemingly small, pretty much always play well, and that's a big part of why deserts have been so successful collectively. While in Standard, it saw play in most green creature decks, like the +1/+1 counter-focused Golgari Constrictor deck, as well as more straightforward aggro decks like Selesnya and Mono Green. It was also played in some ramp decks, particularly those using Hour of Promise. This sorcery lets you search up 2 lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped, and note that it just says land, and not basic. And that means you can grab deserts, but the upside doesn't end there. If you control 3 or more deserts after it grabs those 2 lands, you also get 2 2/2 zombie tokens. One of the downsides of big ramp spells like this is often that they don't do anything to add to the board, but in a ramp deck with some deserts, you often end up spending 5 to get 2 2/2s, whatever 2 deserts you wanted, and you ramp your mana in a big way. That's a great deal. It's also been played alongside Hour of Promise and Pioneer, but it's even more successful there in more straightforward aggro decks. However, it doesn't have any top 8 since 2024, so it may end up slipping down the list in the future. At number 6, it's Sunscorched Desert. When it enters, it does 1 damage to target player, and you can tap it for colorless. This desert is what inspired the Outlaws of Thunder Junction cycle that has the same enters trigger. Unlike them, it enters untapped, but it can also only produce colorless mana. For many decks, a land with this small of upside and the inability to produce colored mana wouldn't be worth it, but there was one standard deck that loved it, and that was of course Mono Red Aggro. The strain on the mana was more minimal, and being able to do 1 damage with your land for no mana at all is a huge deal, especially because the deck ran another desert that could turn this one into even more upside, but more on that later. It also sees sporadic play in Modern, where it usually appears in the aforementioned Calibrated Blast deck. A huge chunk of the time, doing 15 with a revealed Emrakul is enough to finish off the opponent, because players in Modern pay so much life on Fetch Land, Shock Lands, Thoughtseize, and so on, but it's not always enough, and that's where Sunscorched Deserts come in. It can do the last few damage you need. Its most recent Modern top 8 came earlier this year, so it may be putting up more top 8s in the future. At number 5, it's Ifnir Deadlands. Part of the same cycle as Hashep Oasis, meaning it can tap for colorless or you can pay a life and tap it for black, and it also comes with an activated ability, one that costs 2 generic and 2 black, and you tap this and sacrifice a desert to put 2 -1/-1 counters on target creature and opponent controls, but only at sorcery speed. So the Deadlands gives you a land that can turn into a straight-up removal spell, and even if it isn't efficient at doing it, this is a land that can kill a creature. And even when it can't outright kill something, the effect can drastically weaken your opponent's position. It saw play in many different aggressive black decks in Standard, like mono-black zombies and Mardu vehicles, as well as black-white tokens. In Pioneer, it's been played in mono-black control, as well as the aforementioned Hour of Promise decks. While that sorcery is just great with deserts in general, the fact it gives you access to so many deserts with different abilities makes that card even more powerful, since it can tutor up whichever desert is the most useful for you. More recently, it's been played in mono black aggro decks in Modern. In that deck, the fact it's a land that produces both colorless and black is actually perfect, because in addition to a bunch of black cards, the deck uses both Thought-Knot Seer and Kozilek's Command, spells that require colorless mana. So it's almost a dual land with upside in that specific deck. Ifnir Deadlands is still actively putting up top 8s in Modern. At number 4, it's Ipnu Rivulet. The blue land in the Hour of Devastation cycle, its activated ability lets you pay 1 generic and a blue and sacrifice a desert to have target player mill 4 cards. Milling yourself or your opponent can deliver value in the right deck, and this is a repeatable engine that can do it, provided you have some other deserts around. It's especially good if you're playing a deck that can generate a ton of value out of the graveyard, since in the right deck, this feels like a land that can basically just draw you cards. And indeed, it's been played in every single format and almost always in graveyard decks. For example, in Standard it was used in God Pharaoh's Gift decks, which could turn creatures in the graveyard into creatures on board. Notably, it was also played in blue-white control decks that look to win the game with Approach of the Second Sun. This sorcery goes into your library 7th from the top after you cast it, but if it's the second time you cast it in the game, you just win, and Ipnu Rivulet can help you redraw it by binning some of the cards ahead of it. In Pioneer, it used to be played in Dimir Inverter decks, which look to load the graveyard and then exile most of it before casting the Inverter, and then casting Thassa's Oracle. The first truly busted deck in the history of Pioneer, Ipnu Rivulet was good there because it could help you mill. The Inverter ultimately got banned, but the Rivulet has continued to be successful in Pioneer and other graveyard decks like Delirium and Lotus Field. In Modern, it's been played in prison decks, which like to lock the opponent out of the game with artifacts like Ensnaring Bridge and Chalice of the Void. In that style of deck, the Rivulet is often used as a win condition alongside Crucible of Worlds, which lets you play lands from your graveyard, and that means you can activate the Rivulet every turn until your opponent runs out of cards. In Legacy, it's been played in lands decks, which look to construct game-winning combos with lands, but they also run lots of silver bullet lands to search up in the right situation with crop rotation, and the Rivulet sometimes makes the cut as one of those. And in Vintage, it's a sideboard card, one usually brought in against Doomsday decks, which intentionally shrink the size of their deck to 5 cards, but obviously the Rivulet can dismantle that pretty quickly. However, despite that significant multi-format success, Ipnu Rivulet doesn't have any top 8 so far in 2024. It's probably not done though, this land can just do so much work in the right deck. At number 3, it's Shefet Dunes, the white land in the Hour of Devastation cycle. Its activated ability costs 2 generic and 2 white, and you can tap it and sacrifice a desert to give your whole board +1/+1 until end of turn, but only at sorcery speed. If you're playing a go wide deck in white, it's pretty freaking sweet to have a land that can help you play your 1-drop and curve out in general, and then later in the game, it can just make your board lethal. And like the rest of this cycle, the downside is super minimal. While it saw some play in standard aggro decks, it's been even more successful in Pioneer, where it's been played in decks that are particularly adept at going wide, like Collected Company decks, which are all about getting 2 powerful creatures at a time with company, and Boros Convoke, a deck that looks to get lots of bodies in play to power out powerful Convoke creatures. It also sees play alongside company in Historic and Modern. Shefet Dunes is still actively putting up top 8s in Pioneer. At number 2, it's Scavenger Grounds. It can tap for colorless, and you can pay 2 generic, tap it, and sacrifice it to exile all graveyards. This is a pretty great way to hate on graveyards. Because it's an activated ability, and Scavenger Grounds is never a spell, your opponent's options for countering it are very limited, and because it can give up any desert to do its thing, you can do it more than once. It actually saw more main deck play than sideboard play while it was in Standard, mostly because it slotted really easily into all the decks I've already talked about in that format that ran some of the deserts on this list. The format also had plenty of graveyard decks ranging from Delirium to God Pharaoh's Gift, and having access to this effect in Game 1 is pretty sweet. It's been less successful in Pioneer, but earlier this year it actually started to see more play in the format, appearing in blue-white control, and in Modern it's been played alongside other deserts in Calibrated Blast decks as well as in Eldrazi ramp decks. These decks mostly look to assemble lots of powerful lands that produce multiple mana to cast Eldrazi, and they can search up those lands with tutors like Sowing Mycospawn and Expedition Map, but when you're up against a graveyard deck, grabbing your Scavenger Grounds with those is pretty great too. Scavenger Grounds is still active in both Pioneer and Modern. Speaking of Scavenger Grounds, I hope you don't think I'm a scavenger for asking you to subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to reach 100,000 subscribers later this year, so I'd really appreciate it if you aren't subscribed already. You won't regret it because I put out regular Magic content every single week. And at number 1, it's Ramunap Ruins, the red desert in the Hour of Devastation cycle, which means all 5 of those deserts made this list. And it's not like any of them had a super low score and just barely made it. All of them have been significant cards in multiple formats, which is pretty impressive. Most cycles aren't quite as universally successful. But as good as the other ones are, Ramunap Ruins definitely takes the cake. You can pay 2 generic and 2 red, tap it, and sacrifice it to do 2 damage to each opponent. Once again, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when you're playing a mono red deck, your lands being able to turn into shocks in the late game is amazing and makes it pretty impossible for your opponent to ever stabilize, especially when you're also packing the aforementioned Sunscorched Desert. In fact, this desert was so good that it got banned out of Standard because it was making mono red decks far too powerful. It's gone on to success in red aggro decks in Explorer and Pioneer too. Standard isn't the only format where the Ruins were played alongside Sunscorched Desert either. In Modern, they both see play in Calibrated Blast decks, where they can team up to take down the opponent's last few life after firing off a 15 damage Calibrated Blast. Ramunap Ruins has been highly successful and it continues to finish off many opponents, especially in Pioneer, so it's probably going to remain the number 1 desert for the foreseeable future. So those are Magic's top 10 deserts. If you like dry climates, check out the description, where you can find a direct card kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at various mechanics and subtypes, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.